And those people have changed their own lives. It's not something that we did.
You're responsible for all of it. All of it.
I was blaming my spouse for everything, and our marriage was falling apart. I was the problem here.
We can take ownership of much more than we think we can. It'd be really hard to narrow down and select one story of impact of the book of Extreme Ownership, because quite frankly, just about everywhere I go, someone or two or three or four people will come up to me. They'll shake my hand and say, hey, thank you so much for writing that book. I was able to get promoted at work. I started my own business. I was able to save my marriage. I got my kids on track. Like, the impact that it has and the way that it reached people and the way that people were able to pragmatically take the principles inside that book and apply them in their lives, in every aspect of their lives. That to me it's very hard to narrow it down, but it happens all the time. And it's probably the most gratifying thing about the book, Extreme Ownership, for me, is just knowing on an individual level. And of course, we talk to companies where the CEO of the company will talk about the turnaround that they made, or a department head will talk about how their department is excelling now. And so it definitely works within organizations. But to talk to an individual human being that truly uses extreme ownership, and that is the catalyst that was able to get their life on the right track, to me, that's the most, like I said, it's the most gratifying thing that I've experienced, just to know that this book has been able to help people in so many different situations and help them in really, really dramatic ways.
What surprised me is that people don't just apply this to their work, right? We wrote this book to apply, to business and life. And we gave a combat example. We talked about a principle that we learned on the battlefield and how it applies. And we talked about how it applies in the business world as well. And very early after the book was published, the first time that someone came up to me and said, this book saved my marriage. I took and applied this principle of extreme ownership. I was blaming my spouse for everything. And our marriage was falling apart. We were all but divorced. And I actually realized that I was the problem here. I took ownership of the problem, and now our marriage is back on track, and we have a happy home. And thank you for putting that message out in the world. And we've also heard stories from people who have lost a child or some horrific tragedy that they've gone through in their lives, and how extreme ownership helped them get through and focus on the rest of their family and helping them through that, and in ways that were mind-blowing and beyond anything that we could have comprehended when we actually wrote the book. And those people have changed their own lives. It's not something that we did, but I'm so honored and humbled that they were able to take the leadership lessons that we learned on the battlefield, that we were able to share, and they were able to apply them to make a huge difference and impact in their lives.
Well, I can tell you, I am a beneficiary of that book. That book impacted me the way it does every other reader. And the fact that I knew Leif and Jocko on the battlefield, the fact that I knew them, by no means meant that I understood the depth of the power of the leadership lessons that they captured until I read the book. And quite honestly, when I got a copy of that book, I thought I was gonna read a story about our time together in Iraq. And it didn't occur to me until I started opening up that book. It's like, wow, these are leadership lessons that maybe I had some sense of, but I truly did not understand the depth of the power of those. And so I benefited from that book as much as anybody has. That has changed my life in the same way it has everybody else that's read it, and it has nothing to do with my time with you on the battlefield, my time with you in the military. It's how I learned from them, how the lessons from that experience applied to every aspect of my life. I'm as lucky as everybody else that's read this book, because it has made a huge impact on my life as well. The chapter in the book that is as obvious as it sounds, is the first chapter of ownership. I think you learn the concept of personal responsibility in the military pretty early on. But I've always felt until I read that chapter, there was a part of it that I didn't really understand. And I connect the principle of extreme ownership to undeniably the worst day of my military career is when I lost a Marine in combat. There was nothing worse for me. I read the book about extreme ownership 10 years after that happened. And in my mind, up until the point that I read that chapter, that very first chapter of that book, in my mind, I had taken responsibility for what had happened. Until I read it and realized that I had put a limit on what I was willing to accept in my own responsibility. And what extreme ownership reveals in the very first chapter is that you are responsible for all of it. All of it. And that really hit me like a ton of bricks. And what I was able to do is go back and recognize the places where I was comfortable letting circumstances that seem to be beyond my control as the reason certain things happen. And understanding what it means to take ownership of a problem, of everything associated with that problem, wasn't clear to me, despite all my time leading Marines, until I read that book in that very first chapter. So undeniably, as good as that book is, chapter 1 was the difference maker for me.
Yeah, that's one of those things, I had pretty early on, I was at a speaking engagement and I was doing Q&A and a woman stood up and she asked me a question, which, we get all kinds of questions, but she asked a question about extreme ownership. The question was about the fact that her daughter had come down with a terminal disease. And she told me that and then said, how am I supposed to take ownership of that? And clearly, there are things that happen in life that we as human beings have truly no control over whatsoever. And yet, and what I told her was, although she can't take ownership of this disease and the terrible situation that it's imposed on her and her daughter, what she can take ownership of is how she is going to respond to that. Is she going to curl up into a ball? Is she going to present emotion in front of her daughter that is nothing but exacerbates the stress and the trauma? Or is she going to try and take advantage of the time that she has with her daughter from here on out? Is she going to try and comfort her daughter? Is she going to try and show her daughter that what they have, even in this short period of life that they have, is a gift? And so when you take the attitude of extreme ownership and you truly apply it to what's going on in your world, and I do find that most often people find limitations of taking ownership too early, right? They look at something, they kind of shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's not really my fault. And we can take ownership of much more than we think we can. That being said, there certainly are things that are truly beyond our control. And then what we have to do is we have to take ownership of how we respond to those issues and those problems and how we continue to move forward despite the trauma that we might face in our world.